very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this session today. You are just in time for the Advanced Audit and Assurance in Focus webinar. My name is Martin Mwebia, and I work with ACCA in the team that provides support to ACCA students, and I'm joined by a few of my colleagues in the back end. So today it's all about exam technique. We're going to be looking at time management, which is a key aspect of your exam preparation. And we are joined by AAA expert tutor, Ben Wilson, who's going to be taking us through this session. So I'll hand over to Ben in a bit, but before that, I just want to share a few housekeeping points. There are a number of buttons for your use in this webinar. You'll find a resources button at the bottom of your screen, and that contains the documents and the links to all the resources that we allude to in this webinar. You'll find an attendee chat function. So that's for you to engage with your fellow attendees. Please don't share any personal details on that public forum, but do share any information or advice that you'd like on that session. Importantly, we have the Q&A button. So that's for you to submit any questions that you'd like Ben to respond to, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of this webinar. So we'll be picking your questions live. Do put in any questions you'd like answered early on. Now, in case you experience any lag, the video or the audio not being very nice, please do refresh your browser, and that should resolve the issue. No worries if you miss out on any part of the session, because this webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be available for you from tomorrow. So you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording. I've already mentioned we'll be having a Q&A session at the end, last 10 minutes. So do put in your questions bright and early, and my colleagues and Ben will be addressing those. So thank you so much once again. And without taking much more time, I'll now hand over to Ben to take us through the session. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Martin. Welcome, everybody, to this AAA InFocus session. And broadly, the aim is to give you some advice that's going to help you to pass the exam. That's the main goal. But also plenty of scope for you to ask questions during the session. And there's a formal Q&A part at the end. We'll have at least 15 minutes for Q&A. And I'll be taking questions from the Q&A panel. So if you've got a question, get it in there early. Because then I'm more likely to get to it in the Q&A section. Don't wait until the end to ask your questions. So a bit of an introduction to me. If you haven't come across me before, you probably have, because I'm all over the ACCA's channels for AAA, and there's lots of stuff on my YouTube channel. But in case you haven't met me, I've been working with the ACCA for 3 or 4 years now as expert tutor for the AAA exam paper. That means I deliver lots of these sorts of sessions. I create content for the ACCA's YouTube channel. And I also deliver a lot of train the trainer events for ACCA around the world. One of the reasons that ACCA work with me as their expert tutor for AAA is my background. So I've got a background as an examiner, working with ICAW as an audit examiner. So I really know how examiners think. And I've also spent a long time teaching AAA, both online and in the classroom. So I'm good at giving that advice to students about how best to pass the exams. I operate as an independent personal tutor. So I work with small groups of students and give them lots of personalized coaching to give them their best chance of passing AAA. And when I'm not delivering my AAA course, I also work with the London School of Economics, where I deliver executive education programs around accountancy for non-financial managers. So I've got a broad range of experience in this sector, and hopefully that makes me well placed to give you great advice today. So we've got 3 things broadly on our agenda today, and those images might give you some ideas about what those 3 things are. The first one is all about exam technique. We're going to break that into 2 parts. Firstly, we're going to look at question 1, particularly the case study question, and we're going to talk about answer structure, give you some advice about how to earn the marks for structuring your answer and structuring your answer in a way that helps you to earn more technical marks as well, both professional skills marks and technical marks. And we'll also be focusing on time management tips, because that is such a big part of AAA success, being able to manage your time effectively. Then I'm going to give you a few exam prep tips, what I would advise you to do in the remaining time you have until the exam. And also, well, part of that is really how important it is that you're focusing on question practice, particularly using the practice platform. And then there'll be that at least 15 minutes for live Q&A towards the end. If you want to chat with other students or talk to me during the session, if you've got any comments on what I'm saying, then please put them in the chat panel, attendee chat, and I'll see those as we're doing the session. But if you've got bigger questions, then put them in the Q&A panel, and I'll come to those at the end. So starting off with question 1, the case study question, the big 50 marker. And there are professional skills marks to be had for structuring your answer. And we're going to make sure in this session you know how to earn those, and also how to structure your answer in a way that makes sure you earn as many technical marks as possible. So here's the guidance, and then we're going to apply this guidance using a recent question 1. So the first thing that I do in question 1 is I set up my answer structure, and that allows me to plan my answer. Right? But that basic answer structure is I take each of the requirements and have a subheading for each part of each requirement. Because a little trick they put into AAA is part C of the question, for example, might not just be one question. There might be 2 or even 3 requirements as part of part C. So it's important you capture each of those in your structure, because then it encourages you to answer all parts of the question. Then what I do is I add myself little reminder notes. I might type these in the exam, or I might just think them, depending on how big the question is. In question 1, I normally type them as a little note to myself, and then I remember to delete that note at the end. But notes to help me to write a better answer. I then, in question 1, I earn the briefing notes format and introduction professional skills mark. Yeah, there's 1 mark for having that, for getting the format right. And I'll show you how to get that mark as quickly and efficiently as possible shortly. But I do it at the start because I don't have to think much as I'm doing it. I actually, I can be starting to think about my answer as I am creating my briefing notes format and introduction, because I don't have to think as I'm doing it. It's a process. And then I make sure that I have a specific subheading for materiality in part A of the question, or part B, depending on where the audit risk or ROM question is. It's often part A, or it can sometimes be part B. But I go and get that mark straight away because I need that materiality number to do the rest of my answer, to plan the rest of my answer. But I need to have that materiality section. It needs to be the first thing in my audit risk or ROM answer to make sure that I get the marks for it. Okay, so let's have a look at a recent past exam, and we'll go through those 4 stages together. So I'll show you how I get my basic answer structure. So what I'm doing is I look at each of the requirements and I summarize each requirement into my structure. So part A here is a really simple question. It's evaluate the business risks. Right? So part A underlined, that's all I'm doing to set up my answer structure. Part B is another really simple one, but I have put in capitals the and to remind myself to do it. I have to do the evaluation of my ROMs, but I also need to prioritize my ROMs. And that means my top 2 ROMs, the ones that I think are most significant, I have to explain why those 2 are my top 2. The way that I do that is I make them my first 2 risks. And I have my little explanation there right at the start, because otherwise I forget to do it. Very often, if I run out of time in this part of the question, which most students will, because it's the biggest question in the exam, you can have your prioritization in a little conclusion at the end of part B. But I wouldn't recommend you do that. I'd recommend you just make your first 2 risks in that section, your prioritized ones, and you explain why they're prioritized there and then, because that you're more likely to remember to do it that way. The next part of this question is part C. Principal audit procedures in respect of the expenditure related to the store enhancement program. So you can copy and paste these, by the way, from the requirement into your answer to set up your structure. No problem with doing that. I tend to type them just because it allows me to think a bit as I'm typing, but you can do it either way. And then part D here is actually several requirements. Okay, the first is discuss the ethical issues. The second is I need to have a conclusion. Because the verb is discuss the ethical issues, then there will be a mark for having a conclusion. So having spotted the verb is discuss, I then have a conclusion subheading to remind me to include a conclusion. And then there's another requirement, which is recommend actions to be taken. So again, that's a separate sub requirement, so I'm having a separate subheading for it. Then I will add myself little reminder notes in. Reminder notes are there to help me plan and write a more effective answer. So some examples of the kind of things I'd be reminding myself of. In part B here, I need to prioritize those top 2 risks. So I just write it as a little note to remind me to do it. And then with my audit procedures, they need to be only main ones, right? Principal audit procedures. So it can't be basic, boring ones, generic ones. So things like cast the schedule of expenditure, add it up, right? That's too basic. That's not going to score. And in fact, if you put that, because it's too basic, it's not a principal main test, you actually would lose out on a communication professional skills mark. Because one of the professional skills marks there for communication is for adhering to the requirements. And if you're asked, only tell me about the big ones, the principal ones, the main ones, and you talk about one that isn't, then you're not answering the question. So you would not earn that professional skills mark. The other reminder I'm putting myself here, because this is a procedures question, and increasingly in AAA, in the procedures question, the examiner is being really specific about what they want those procedures to focus on. So here, the procedures have to be about the expenditure on this store enhancement program. So I'm putting that as a reminder. It's only about expenditure. The explanation that I give for my audit test, my audit procedure, has to explain how it gives me evidence over the expenditure, the amount that's been spent. So that's me saying, Ben, when you're writing up each of the procedures, make sure the last sentence says how it gives evidence over expenditure, because that way I'll get a full mark for each procedure. If you don't explain how it gives evidence over expenditure, you'll only get half a mark for your procedure. So it's a really good tip that in the procedures question, you make sure you bring back each point to exactly what it's asking. And then within my ethics, my little reminder note here is about what the conclusion is. Right? Here, my conclusion, it says discuss the ethical issues that are arising. And by discuss, it kind of means tell me if they're a big deal or not a big deal, right? Backwards and forwards. Big deal, not a big deal. And overall, I need a conclusion to say, this is a particularly serious matter because of this. So my conclusion has to conclude on how serious the ethics issue is, what issues are, and that conclusion has to be justified, which means I can't just say it's a big deal. I have to say it's a serious issue because, and the because has to be something from my analysis, something from my answer to support my conclusion. Okay, the third thing that I have to do in my setting up my structure for question 1 is I need to make sure I earn the 1 professional skills mark that there is for communication for structure. And it's so important you earn this mark. The reason being, the most common mark that people fail AAA with is 49. And if you score 49 and you haven't earned this mark, it's criminal. You'll be kicking yourself. Right? So it's really important you earn this mark because it can make the difference between passing and failing. So how do I get it? Well, the first thing that I do is I need to have to, from, subject, and date. And the way that I do this as efficiently as possible is I copy that information from the scenario, paste it into my answer, and then all I do is switch around the to and from. Okay, so I do that bit really quickly. And then my introduction, which comes as the first bit of my answer to question 1. Again, I do this by copying and pasting. So I'm copying and pasting all of the requirements into here, and then I just delete bits to make it stick together. Because basically all I'm doing is saying these briefing notes will, and then if you notice from that point, if you read from evaluate, all that I've done is evaluate the business risk faced by the group. Look, it's exactly the same wording as there is in the requirement because I've copied and pasted it. Evaluate and prioritize the risks. Part B has been copied and pasted. Part C, design the principal audit procedures. Part D, ethics issues and actions. All it is a copy and paste of the requirements. So that's how I'd recommend that you get the introduction mark as quickly as possible, right? Copy, paste, make it look pretty. You earn that mark in no time at all. Okay, that's my third bit of structure stuff for question 1. And the fourth bit of structure stuff is that I have to have a specific subheading for materiality, and it has to go as the first subheading within the ROM or the audit risk question, which is here, part B. In part A, materiality is not relevant, okay, because business risks are risks that are impacting the company, their ability to hit their targets and to perform going forward, and that's an issue for the business, not an issue for the materiality of misstatements. Okay, so in part A, materiality is not relevant. Part B is where materiality is relevant, and therefore that is where my materiality paragraph should go. So to earn the marks for your materiality paragraph, and there are, wait for it, 3 technical marks for this materiality paragraph. 3 really easy marks, right? Got to make sure you earn them. So the first thing you have to do is you calculate materiality based on whatever measure the partner has told you. So here in this paragraph, it tells us base the analysis on revenue, your materiality on revenue. So I set my materiality range at 0.5% to 1% of revenue. You know, it could have said PBT, in which case it would have been 5 to 10% of PBT. Or if it's total assets, it's 1 to 2%. So it's not always 0.5 to 1%, but if it's revenue, it is 0.5 to 1%. So I take the materiality figure. Sorry, I take the PBT figure. No, I don't. Third time lucky, Ben. I take the revenue figure for the year that was being audited, and there's a financial extract that came from. It was 45 million, by the way. And I calculate 0.5% and 1% of that. So I calculate my materiality range. I then always set my materiality level at the low end. I always set it at 2.25 million, or whatever my low calculation is. Now you'll see different answers do it in different ways. The examiner might do it at 3 million or 4.5 million. But as long as you set your materiality level somewhere between 2.25 and 4.5, that's totally fine. Anywhere is fine. Anywhere. The important thing is that you justify it. Okay? And I can always make this justification. The justification I've used is this is a high-risk audit. It has to be a high-risk audit because I'm in the exam. I need to have been given in the scenario a bunch of audit risks, a bunch of things that could be wrong in the financial statements, because otherwise the question won't work. Yeah, there's 16 marks available for audit risks here, so there has to be quite a lot of audit risks in the scenario. In which case, I can quite comfortably justify that this is going to be a high-risk audit, because every risk audit in the AAA exam can always be high risk, because they'll give you plenty of audit risks to go at. So I'm going to say it's high risk, and then I need to find something from the scenario to explain why it's high risk. So if you've looked at this exam, you might have spotted this, but it doesn't matter. Don't worry about the content. of what I've put here. I just wanted to see the style and structure of it. So I need a short statement of something from the scenario which makes it a high-risk audit. They've just expanded overseas, so there's more chance that they make an error. Or I could pick something else from the scenario. Right? I could say, in this scenario, it tells us that the Group FD doesn't understand the accounting standards of this new acquisition. So I'm using that as my justification. Or I could pick something else. They've just taken out a big bank loan. And so there's more risk that management cook the books. They fiddle the numbers to make sure that they don't breach their bank loan covenants. Right? So I just chose to do the overseas acquisition one, but I could have put the second one, or I could have put the third one. It doesn't matter what your justification is, as long as it is valid and based on something from the scenario. And so by putting these 3 paragraphs, I'm earning 3 marks. I'm well on my way to passing this question. I've just earned 3 out of the 16 technical marks. I'm off to a great start. Okay, so I like to get that, bag those marks early, because now I feel confident I'm well on my way to passing this question. Okay, another area of technique that we're going to focus on today is around time management. And the reason it's so important to focus on time management is that AAA is incredibly time pressured, unbelievably time pressured. And so you need to have tactics for dealing with it. So my first tip or tactic for you around time management is the order in which you do the questions. And if you've watched any of my stuff before, you probably know what I'm going to say here. Okay, I strongly advise you to start the exam with question 2 and then question 3. Whoa! You might be surprised at that if you're hearing it for the first time. Surely you're supposed to start with question 1, aren't you? But question 1 is massive. Question 1 has 4 or 5 exhibits for you to read. Question 1 I can get lost in. If you start with question 1, it's much more likely that your time management goes out the window. Whereas question 2 and question 3 are much smaller, right? Smaller scenarios, less requirements. It's easier to be disciplined and stick to your timings if you start with question 2 and question 3. So you do those first of all, and then you do question 1 last. And actually, I don't do question 1, A, B, C, D. If we go back, I'm just going to flick back to the previous slide. Can I get to it? This question, I would have started with part C. Audit procedures, first of all, because I only need to use exhibit 4 for those. So I bag my audit procedures marks. Then I do part D, the ethics. And then I come back and do the risk bits last of all, because it's the risk bits that take ages. And then I know how much time I've got left to do the most time-consuming bit of the exam. So I'm just going to flick through, back to where we were. Okay, now, whatever order you do the exam in, you have to be disciplined with your timings. Yeah. If you are going to overrun hugely, it's really hard to pass AAA. Right? But I would encourage you to do it this way. So you do question 2, then question 3, then you do question 1 and do the quicker, simpler bits first, and then you do the risk bit last of all, because it's the risk bit that can make your timings go off. But as I said, wherever you start the exam, if you follow my advice and do 2 and 3 first, you've got to be really disciplined with your timings. Okay? You can't overrun anywhere. So you need to spend an absolute maximum of 45 minutes in question 2. Okay? That should be enough time to do question 2 to earn enough marks to pass. You cannot write a perfect answer in AAA. You can't write like the examiner writes. You can't put the amount of detail they put in their answer. Because there just isn't time to do it. You've got 45 minutes to do what you can in question 2. And then a further 45 minutes to do what you can in question 3, which then leaves you an hour and 45 minutes to do question 1. You'll notice that that means I'm using all of the reading time for question 1. Okay? And I think that's valid because there's so much more information to digest in question 1. My other tip for you to stick to those timings of 45 minutes for question 2, 45 for question 3, is you have to be realistic about what you can do in that amount of time. So I'm not trying to write a perfect answer. The first bit I do in question 2, I'm not trying to be perfect and be amazing. I'm trying to be good enough, right? I'm trying to earn enough marks to pass. So I'm not trying to be perfect. I'm getting through the question on time. And if I hit something difficult, some tough financial reporting, something that I haven't revised, a question that I haven't really prepared for, I'll have a go and then I move on. Because if there is a difficult bit, some hard financial reporting that you don't know, you're probably not going to earn any marks on it. But if you don't earn any marks and you move on quickly, you can earn enough marks elsewhere to pass the exam. But if you get stuck in the hard bit and you spend ages earning no marks, then that can throw you off and mean that you don't pass the exam. So if something's difficult, have a go at it and then move on to somewhere where you're more comfortable. And remember the goal, right? The goal is to score 50 or just above. I mean, there may be some people on this call who are wanting to win a prize. You know, to win the prize for AAA, last sitting, the prize winner scored 84%. If you score in the 70s, you're likely to be a national prize winner if you're outside of the UK. If you score in the 70s, you're likely to be in the top 25 or so students that are in the exam sitting. Right? AAA is a really hard exam to score high marks in. There's normally a small handful of students who score 80 or above. For most students, the goal is to score 50, right? Or 51, 52 and pass the exam. And so I'm speaking to you now, if that is describing you. You've got to go around this exam and earn 50 easy marks, and there will be 50 easy marks. Right? If you get to something difficult, you go, do you know what? That bit looks hard. I'll have a go. I move on. I don't need to smash the hard bit to pass the exam. I just need to keep picking up easy marks, picking the low-hanging fruit, and I will pass the exam. Super effective for this exam. Okay, I was going to give a bit of advice on exam preparation tips for how to spend the last 3 weeks before the exam. Things I would advise you to be doing as much as possible over the remaining time that you have left. So at this stage of your revision, I would expect you to be starting to move on to be doing full exam papers. Doing questions to time, so important. And doing full exams, I know it's painful, but it's really, really helpful for practicing your time management. So ACCA's data shows that students who do full exams on the practice platform and do them properly, pass rate amongst those students is 14% higher. It's materially higher for students who are doing full exams as part of their preparation for AAA. So an excellent exam for you to do is the pre-June 24 mock exam. Now, this exam is going to be released by ACCA next week. So it'll be available for you to sit on the practice platform on the Monday of next week, the 13th. And these are excellent questions. Right? They've come from the examining team. That's not often, that hasn't been the case in the past. So if you are a resitter for AAA and you did the pre-March 24 mock, or you did the pre-December 23 mock, those weren't questions from the examining team. These questions are. So they are absolutely the examiner's latest style because they've come from the examining team. So they're brilliant, right? And they're really, really worth doing as part of your exam practice. So definitely do the pre-June 24 mock. And then there are 4 past exam papers available for you to do. That again are the examiner's latest style. So you can get all of these on the practice platform. And I would be recommending that you do them in this order. Right? The best one is the pre-June 24 mock because it comes with debrief resources. And then the other exams that are there are just there in order of age. So the most recent exams being the better ones. So make sure that you are building in doing all of these full exam papers as part of your exam preparation. When you are doing those exams, And when you're doing any other question practice, you might be doing some questions from the study hub, or your training provider might have given you other questions to practice. It is really important that you're doing them against the clock. Now, the time pressure in AAA is absolutely awful. It's horrendous. How long would you really want to be able to do this exam? Right, to actually do it properly, right? To have a, I would want 5 or 6 hours, I think. Would I actually want to spend 5 or 6 hours doing it? Probably not. Painful. But to actually do it justice, you'd want 5 or 6 hours. The examiner takes weeks to write their answer. They expect you to do it in 3 hours and 15 minutes. It's absolutely brutal. There's so much to do. It has so much information to use and so much to construct in your answer. So the time pressure is unbelievable. But the more that you experience it, the more you get used to it. Now, when I feel the time pressure, I experience it as like a knot in my stomach. Do you get that feeling? Where, and it's really uncomfortable. That feeling might be different for you, but I'm sure it's not pleasant. Right? But the more you get used to having that feeling, the more it feels normal, then the more that you can perform at something close to your best in the exam, even though that feeling is there. Whereas if you don't do any of your training questions against the clock, when you get into the exam and that feeling hits you in your stomach, then it can overwhelm you and it can really throw you off. Okay, so strongly recommend you're practicing questions against the clock from now. And I'd probably say every question you do from now, you should be doing against the clock. The more you get used to that feeling, the better it gets. Actually, not the better it gets, the more you develop techniques to cope with it. And it really does help. Okay, the more you practice against the clock, the better you will get at coping. And actually, just on that, 3 hours and 15 minutes to do a full exam paper for AAA. I'd be recommending that you spend as long debriefing that exam as you do doing it. So a perfect day for doing a AAA mock is do the mock in the morning, have a couple of hours break, and then do a debrief in the afternoon. But the things I'd be advising you to do as part of your debrief is to mark your answer. Okay? Or you could get into a study buddy group and swap answers with other students and mark each other's, but use the ACCA marking guide to do it, because that way critically evaluating your answer really helps you to see how to improve it. I'd be advising you to make notes on things you missed, things that are in the marking plan, things that are in the examiner's answer that you didn't pick up on, because those things will help to add value if you get a similar style question in the future. And if you're doing those past exam papers that I suggested, so the 4 recent past exams, all of those have examiner's comments, where the examiner has given you commentary based on how actual students did in that exam. That tells you what strong students did well and what weaker students missed out on. It's a gold mine of information. So I'd be going through that and making notes as well. And here's the bit that most students don't do. Most students don't go back and do the questions again. They want to do more questions. Right? I need to do volume. I need to have practiced every question on the study hub before I go into the exam. I need to have done every question in my training provider's exam kit before I go in. Okay? My advice is that quality question practice is way more beneficial than quantity. Okay? This isn't a volume exam, right? It isn't. So in an exam like financial management, if you practice enough NPV or weighted average cost of capital calculations, you'll have seen every trick that the examiner can throw at you. So practice loads of past exam questions. You'll have already seen everything they can ask you in the exam, and you're better able to cope. So volume is important in that exam. In AAA, there's literally thousands of different audit risks they can ask you about, depending on the industry, the scenario, and what they ask you to focus on. There's thousands of different procedures they can ask you about, depending on the company and the scenario and the specific question that's asked. Because there are so many things they can ask you in AAA, even if you did every past exam paper, everyone that there's ever been, everyone in the study hub, every question in the kit. When you get into your actual exam, you will find that every question in there is completely different to the ones that you've practiced. So the point of the question practice in AAA is not to rote learn the answers. Don't do that. And it's not to be ready, oh, I've seen this thing in a question, therefore I write this. Because that doesn't work in AAA. The point of the question practice is to improve your technique of generating answers. So I find it's really helpful for students improving their technique if they go back and repeat a question where they're familiar with the question a little bit. It allows them to better work on their technique rather than I must do another different question, another different question, another different question. You actually get more out of repeating one you've already done, particularly the bits you struggle with, than bouncing on and doing more questions. Okay, this has been set up as a poll, and I I think you're able to answer this poll, although I'm not. I'm slightly unfamiliar with polls in this format. But the pre-June 24 mock that I've already spoken about and the debrief is going to be released next week. And the answer to this is, and I don't think you really need to answer it as a poll. It is C. It is the 17th. Sorry, the 13th and the 17th of May. Well done to those of you who got it right. So on Monday, the questions are going to be released. And on Friday, there are some debrief videos being released that will be on the ACCA's YouTube channel to help you with those questions. Okay. That's it for the live presentation part. And I'm now going to take some questions. There were some questions that were pre-submitted, though, by students. So thank you to everyone who pre-submitted questions. So I'm going to go through some of those to start off with. So the first question on this list. Why do people fail AAA even though most of the questions are repeated every sitting? Well, the questions aren't repeated. There's always a question on either audit risk or risk of material misstatement. But the industry and the scenario and the question will be entirely different. So you change the scenario, you change the industry, you change the specifics that are given to students, and you completely change the answers that are required. Procedures. There's always questions on procedures. But if you make it about a different assertion, so we saw that example there where it was just about expenditure, or it could be about the valuation of an investment or the completeness of some costs. By changing the assertion that's being asked about, then you completely change the answer that's required. So that first question, I think one of the reasons people fail is because they do try and question spot, and they do try to rote learn previous answers, and that really doesn't work in AAA. The second question on here, I get panicked when I'm reading the case study, and I don't know how to answer it. How can I improve this? Well, the case study has several exhibits within it. So I find it helpful to just have a process that I follow. Right? My process that I follow for every question is I start by setting up my answer structure. I then make general notes from the background exhibit. I then add notes into my answer plan by actively reading the scenario, and then I write up my answer plan. And that's how I approach every question. So even if the question's hard, having that standard approach means that I just kind of click into following my process. So I find that helpful. But the advice I gave earlier about do the easier bits of question 1 first, I think you'll find really helpful. Because if you go to part C, for the one that we just did, or we looked at earlier, which was procedures around the store expenditure program, you only had to read exhibit 4 to do that. So go to any parts where you only have to read one exhibit and do those, get those out of the way, builds up your confidence for the rest of the question. The third question on here, ACCA highly recommends the use of the study hub. Do I need to use it? Do I need a study text? Okay, study hub is useful for the questions that are on it, the exam questions for AAA. if you read the study text, right, the one on the Study Hub, or you might buy one from BPP or Kaplan or another training provider, the study text is massive, right? 600, 700 pages, and it's full of detailed knowledge-based information. This exam is not a detailed knowledge-based exam. It is application. So you do need some knowledge, but a bit, and you need great exam technique and application skills to be able to pass. If you focus on reading the textbook and learning the textbook, you're kind of missing the point of AAA. So my advice, and I tell this to all the students on my course, is please don't read the textbook. Right? It will take you about 30 hours to read the Kaplan textbook from cover to cover, or the BPP one, or the ACCA one, and it will not help your chances of passing the exam. So what's the point of doing it? The activity that is helpful is practicing questions, right? And improving your exam technique. That's how you pass this exam. It's a problem-solving exam, not a knowledge exam. So don't read study text because it's pointless for this exam. Fourth question on here: how do I shorten my AAA responses to manage my time? And this is a really effective one, right? My advice to you is start every sentence with a direct word. So not there is, or there has been a 15% increase in revenue, right? Don't say that. You say revenue. Revenue increased by 15%. And actually, you don't say that. You don't say revenue increased by 20% or whatever. You say revenue went up by 20%. Because what we're trying to do, so number one, you start your sentence with a direct word that means something, tells you what the rest of the sentence and the paragraph is about. That helps you to write in a more direct style. First tip. Second tip, use really short words. Up rather than increased. Because up, even if you're old like me and you type with one finger, up is only 2 presses. Increased, so short words. And short sentences, aim at no more than 10 words in a sentence. And as much as possible, use full stops rather than commas. You don't want long, complicated subclause sentences in AAA. You want boom, 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 boom. Short sentences, short words, short paragraphs, full stops helps you to do that. And that helps you to save time because you've got less time typing. The fifth question on here, will there be a knowledge-based question? There might be. This is something that happened in the last exam sitting. There was a knowledge-based question on quality and quality assurance. There might be. If there is a knowledge-based question, it will probably be based on one of the recent technical articles. So make sure you read the technical articles. How much should I write to get 3 marks for an audit risk? Okay, so my rule to earn a mark in AAA is generally 1 mark per well-explained point, right? And a well-explained point takes me generally 2 sentences. 2 sentences for a well-explained point. So to get 3 marks for an audit risk, I'm looking at 6 short sentences. Okay. Some people can, that's a good aim, right? Some people write a bit more than that, but it's not necessary. Yeah, if you're writing in a direct style without waffle, 2 sentences per mark is enough. How should you structure an audit procedure? That's the last one on here. Well, I'd advise you to go to the ACCA's technical articles for AAA. And there is a brilliant video recorded by a very wise, experienced AAA expert tutor, me, all about audit procedures. So it's well worth going and looking at that. So it's in the technical articles section. It's a topic explainer on audit procedures. But broadly, with an audit procedure, what I try to do is I start with a fact from the scenario I'm trying to verify. I then suggest a source document, something that is going to give me evidence over that fact, and then I explain how the test works. So that's my standard approach for an audit procedure to get the 1 mark per well-explained audit procedure that will be available. Okay, that's the pre-submitted questions, which leaves me the 15 minutes that we talked about for going through questions that people have asked live in the session. So to try and make this as easy to follow as possible, what I'll do is I will try and sort of summarize or read out the question a little bit so that you know what I'm answering. So bear with me a little bit as I do this. Okay, Suzanne got on early and asked a question about the UK variant. So if I'm doing the UK variant or the Irish variant or Singapore or whatever, do I have to base my answers on UK accounting standards or on IFRS? Because there's conflicting guidance. Suzanne, I would encourage you not to worry about it too much, because the accounting standards they tend to put into the AAA exam aren't things, they don't focus on the real like micro differences between UK and international, or Irish and international. What they try and do is write a question that can be used for the UK variant, the Irish variant, the Singapore variant, as a single common question. And so the accounting will be on something that is fairly standard and not particularly different between the different variants. I would encourage you just to worry, just focus on the international stuff, because that's how they write the exam. You know, they write the international question and then they create variants from it. And so I would encourage you to be all over IFRS, and don't worry too much, would be my answer. Anula, is it okay to write in full sentences but in bullet points? Yeah, bullet points are okay in most of this exam, as long as you are writing, as you say, in full sentences. The one place where you might not want to put bullet points is in question 1 in the briefing notes, because you could get marked down for your communication skill there for briefing note format. If the requirement is like list the procedures or something, like a verb like list, then bullet points is probably okay in question 1. But for something like evaluate the audit risks, then an evaluation is probably not appropriate to have as a bullet point. Okay, Anula, I hope that answered your question. Priscilla, is there a writing technique for communicating writing to those charged with governance? So those charged with governance, the kind of oversight of the company, someone that the auditor does report to as part of the audit, and is a common question in AAA. What should be reported to those charged with governance? So is there a writing technique? What they tend to be asking, Priscilla, is what should be reported? So what things would be included in the report to those charged with governance? They don't generally ask you to draft the actual report to those charged with governance. So it's not like, in question 1, it's briefing notes format, so it needs to be in professional style and that sort of thing. What they're asking is, what would you put in, what content would you put into it? Not, can you actually write the report to those charged with governance? But, so don't worry about it. But if they did ask you that, then it just needs to be professional language. Yeah. So don't use slang. Try and avoid abbreviating. Don't use I and we. Instead, use third person. So instead of I have written this letter, it's this letter has been written. Okay, Samuel has asked, it is my 3rd attempt at the AAA sitting, and I've always been in the 40s. How can I do things differently this time? So Samuel, first thing to say to you is, don't beat yourself up too much. Lots of people take many attempts to pass AAA. I worked with a student last sitting who passed, so they'd failed several times, then came to me and then passed, and they passed on their 16th attempt. Right? So people do take a lot of attempts to pass AAA. It's a hard exam, right? So that's the first thing to say to you. And the experience you gain from those earlier exams really helps. Right? So a lot of people pass on the 3rd or 4th attempt, as you're describing. So important for you, Samuel, was to reflect on what went wrong last time. Why didn't you pass? Did you give it your all? Did you give it every bit of effort you could? Did you practice all those recent past exam questions? Did you focus your studies appropriately? Right? Did you do lots of question practice rather than rote learning and learning the textbook, right? So as much question practice as possible, and I would encourage you to make changes. So one simple change is the order you do the questions in. Another simple change you can make is when you study. So for most people, I would recommend you study in the morning before work, rather than wait until the end of the day when you're tired and work overruns and then you miss your study session. Get up and do your study session before work. You're more likely to actually do it then. But yeah, you're trying to identify what went wrong for you, Samuel, and put in place things to address it. Kirsty asked, do I think the June exam will go back to the prior format? Because there was a different type of question. So Kirsty, the examiner is broadly using two types of question in question one now. Most question ones are our standard, evaluate the business risks, evaluate the risks of material statement, kind of like what I just showed you on screen there. Sometimes they're using a different format, and that different format is saying inventory has been identified as a significant risk of misstatement. So telling you inventory is a problem, and then saying, can you explain why, based on the scenario? Now, although that's a different structure of question, it's not asking you the same thing. It's not saying, can you identify and evaluate the risks? It's telling you inventory is the problem and asking you to explain why. The technique is exactly the same. You still have to go into the scenario and find things about inventory that explain why it could be misstated. So the technique's not really any different. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, Kirsty. The examiner is intending on using that question format going forward. Sometimes. So it's not every question is going to look like that one that you got, but there will be question variants that do. In general, there are two variants of question one that students get. And in March, one of them is what you're talking about, Kirsty, that was a slightly different format, and the other question was a more standard format. And the examiner has said that they intend to continue using that new format as well as the old format. Kashif has asked, how do I tackle matters to consider questions? So matters to consider questions, and this applies to a lot of other questions as well. I go to the scenario, right? And the things that need to be considered will all come from the scenario. See the scenario. This is how the examiner thinks, right? The scenario is where they are dropping clues for you, little starter clues. And your job is to take the examiner's little starter clue they've dropped for you in the scenario, take it, and then expand it out into an evaluation or discussion point or whatever the question wants you to do. So for matters to consider questions and all other ones, my starting point is go to the scenario, find something, and then develop it. Kashif has also asked, which of the accounting standards do I need to focus on? Well, I can't answer that. They can ask you about any of them. My advice to you with accounting standards is they're important. You need to know a bit about all of the accounting standards that are in SBR because they're all examinable. But it's not the SBR exam. Right? You don't need to know every detail of the accounting standards. You need to know a bit about them, about each one, so that if leases or pensions or inventory or capitalizing research and development expenditure or revenue recognition, these are all ones that have been tested recently, by the way. If one of those comes up, that you know enough about the accounting standard that you can cope with the question. But the question isn't going to give you loads of marks for writing out the accounting standard. It's going to be for using the scenario. Okay, so I need to know a bit about each accounting standard so that I can problem solve in the exam. Nilufer has asked, can I calculate the wrong materiality if I'm able to justify it? I mean, it's a hard question to answer, Nilufer, because it should be really simple to calculate materiality. Right? So if it's PBT, you take the PBT figure and times it by 5% and times it by 10%. So you shouldn't really get it wrong. But if you did, for some reason, you make a calculator mistake, then you'll lose the mark for the calculation. But then if you use your number appropriately from then, you should get follow-through credit. But my advice to you really, Nilufer, is there are some easy marks to be had in AAA and loads of harder marks. Some of the easiest marks to get are for calculating materiality. So I would do it slowly and thoroughly and don't make a mistake. Doomna has asked, how can we prioritize the risks in question 1? So my advice, Doomna, is your first 2 risks, you prioritize those. It doesn't really matter which risks you prioritize, as long as you have prioritized 2 of them. So whichever the first 2 are that you come up with, just make those your most important risks and say why that one's your most important. This risk has been prioritized because and the second one, this risk has been prioritized because of So the mark is for prioritizing the risk and justifying why it's been prioritized using the scenario. It's not that you have to actually pick the 2 that the examiner thinks is the biggest risks. It's for the process. Garcia, why is the most common mark to fail 49? Well, because if you're a maths person, you might have remembered from maths normal distributions. So it's a normal distribution of how people set out how the marks are set out for AAA. And so that means that the marks are quite bunched up. Most people score between 40 and 60 in the exam. It's really bunched. So it's very narrow around the pass-fail line. So 47, 48, 49, these are the most common fail marks. Most people get close, but don't quite get there. That means try and take it positively, Garcia. Try and take it positively. That means if you can add a couple more marks in with a slight improvement in technique across the exam paper, you stand a much better chance of passing. Igodolo. Hi, Ben. Relating to question 1, if you put it in a report format, can one answer the questions without the order as it's asked? Well, Igodolo, I've said, question 1, do part C, then part D, then do part A, then do part B. But it's typed, isn't it? Right? So you do part C first of all, and then when you do part B, you just type it above part C. So you don't need to reformat it. I'm saying, so it's in the same way as you do anything on computer, you can just add in stuff above, can't you? So I wouldn't worry about that too much. Priscilla, how significant is management bias, considering the fact that you do not calculate materiality for it? So management bias, if there is a management bias indicator in question 1 or 2 and 3, so that might be that there's a bonus scheme for management, or the company is trying to list. It's really important that you use that fact to add depth to some of your points, because that's a reason that management might have overstated the numbers, and that's you using your judgment. That's you earning a professional skills mark. So really important that you do it. It's very significant, Priscilla, but it's probably not part of your materiality calculation. Okay. Richard has asked, when do you use the spreadsheet? I don't use it at all. You might use it to do some calculations, but you only score marks for calculations in AAA if you discuss the number in your report. And so I would encourage you to just do the simple calculation in your calculator and then spend the time discussing the number in your report. I find that if people do lots of numbers in their spreadsheet, they copy and paste all the numbers and do loads of calculations, they don't discuss those numbers and they don't score any marks for them. So I wouldn't really encourage you to use the spreadsheet at all, Richard. Okay, I've got time for one more question. I've got a good one to pick for the last one. Amna has asked, will every audit risk be 3 marks? Most of them are, Amna. Most are. But if there's a lot of information given about a particular risk, it could be worth 4. And if there's not very much, it could be 2. But almost always, your audit risks are 3 marks per well-explained risk. So assume that when you are planning out the number of marks that you need for your answer. Okay, well, we've come to the end of today's session. So I hope you found it useful. I tried to get through as many questions as I could in the time that we had available. This session has been recorded, so if you have any bits you want to go back and watch, you can do. But best of luck for the exam, guys. I hope you found today's session useful.